Hi, I'm Sarah Cowgill, along with Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, John Clark, and Tim Donner. And this is the Conservative 5, Liberty Nation's online TV news program. On today's episode, Middle East Mess, we'll explain what happened and where the U.S. is going in Winds of War. We'll talk point and blame in political posturing charades and pivot to the Israeli reactions in Brothers in Arms, rounding out the episode with how much it's going to cost the taxpayers in the cost and casualties. All this and more coming up in this edition of the Conservative 5. We've all been ready for crazy town in the Middle East. President Joe Biden was asked recently what he would tell Iran if he would be so kind about a revenge attack on Israel. He turned to the television cameras with steely, resolute eyes and warned, "Don't." Well, Iran did. Iran attacked Israel with force, launching a reported 320 attack drones, cruise and ballistic missiles. So what happens now? Dare we hope for a diplomatic resolution between Israel and Iran, Dave?
Well, there may be a diplomatic solution available out there, but it should happen after Israel sends a message to Iran that you attack our sovereign territory and you can expect an extremely costly response. Israel must counterattack if there is any hope of preventing a massive missile drone attack in the future. It just must happen. And it will also increase Israel's cachet in any diplomatic solution. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, is there any evidence whatsoever that the Biden administration has the international cachet to achieve a diplomatic solution that puts Iran in its place and makes Israel safe from a direct attack, from Iran in the future? The Biden administration has been a failure in the Middle East by any measure.
Biden basically told the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, that the ironclad support we hear so much about wasn't really solid. Was that just a big lie, or is he trying to walk that fence?
Well, it's a very scary time with such language, and I think there's a naivete here, or else a deliberate effort to abandon Israel. This is a culture in the Arab culture that we may not understand, in which there's a ladder of escalation, and if Israel does not counter, then that would just be encouraging more attacks. So Israel has to counter. John Bolton said so, that this was a complete failure of this administration's deterrence efforts, and just saying don't doesn't work any better than it does on the street. Your word gets out if you're weak. So to say that he doesn't have Israel's back at this point, does that suggest not only that the U.S. would not involve itself in an attack on Iran, but that it would not defend Israel again if there's another attack? So John Bolton, as I say, came out in favor. Antony Blinken came out and saying that Israel should hold back. And the president of Iran said very strongly that if there's another attack, they will attack fiercely and aggressively. This is not an eye for an eye culture. And so really the president is leaving Israel out high and dry, whether or not that's his avowed intention. That is the impact of this potentially.
Where is support coming from for Iran in this whole mess, Andrew?
Well, Israel receives about, 3 to 4 billion a year baseline from the U.S. government. And of course, today it's more because of the billions of dollars the U.S. has been sending to Israel since the October 7th attack. But I think the real question is, where's Iran's financial support coming from? Where's all this money to buy, to build up its cachet of weapons? Now, there's one thing that a lot of people who talk about the politics of situations, that they neglect that the Iranian oil sector has been booming in the last couple of years under Biden. Production is around 3 million barrels a day. It's third in OPEC. Oil exports have been at a 5-year high. Its floating storage vessels have been depleted because they're shipping off that oil. Now, who's buying this oil from Iran? Well, a couple of European countries are, like Germany and Spain, for example. But the majority of Iran's oil revenues come from China. China has been the one who's been scooping up a lot of Iran's oil production. Now, many people question, oh, but what about the sanctions? What about the trade restrictions? All these measures employed by the last two administrations, Trump and Biden. Well, as Liberty Nation has been reporting for the last few years, the de-dollarization campaign has played a big role in allowing China to buy Iranian oil and to allow the Iranian oil and gas sector to flourish, because a lot of these transactions are settled in Chinese yuan, not US dollar, which is huge. And when it comes to the payment systems, Iran has been tapping into the SIPs, which is the Chinese alternative to the SWIFT system. So overall, Iran has been able to fund these terrorist activities through its oil and gas sector. And of course, who can forget to mention the $6 billion that was unfrozen? And on top of that, the Biden administration issuing that 120-day waiver to allow Iraq to buy Iranian energy for the next few months.
So you're saying Joe Biden did it? I mean, okay. Well, where is China and Russia? Are they just, waiting to be called on the phone and say, hey, get in the game? I mean, they're the big players out there.
They're the ones that are joining with all of America's sworn enemies or adversaries because it's open season now on the U.S. because Joe Biden has demonstrated consistent weakness and inability to stick with a position. Now what he's done, he has managed to infuriate two heavily Democratic voting groups, Jews and Jew haters. Think about it. The Jews are not happy overall with his response because of his backtracking and willingness his willingness to draw a moral equivalence somehow between the October 7th attack on 1,700 innocent civilians and the fact of a war being started. And he's managed to backtrack on it so the Jewish community is not happy, and the people that hate Jews, and I call them Jew haters instead of anti-Israelis, because their goal is not just to wipe out Israel, but to wipe all Jews off the face of the earth. And both of these sides are entirely dissatisfied with Biden's actions. 33% only of the American people approve of his actions regarding Israel, and he's lost, or more precisely ceded, any semblance of control over this conflict because of his wavering, because neither side trusts him, because neither side sees him as anything but weak and easy to take advantage of.
Dave, geez, when does somebody else put boots on the ground? Is that imminent?
I don't think so. I think that you have a tremendous relucance on the part of the United States to do anything that looks as though it's intervening militarily precisely in Israel. And I just can't imagine that with the feckless attitude that the Biden administration has had toward the Middle East, that would be in their in their quiver of arrows to do that. The only way in which the United States might possibly be involved with boots on the ground as part of a peacekeeping group that would come in from the United Nations. But as we've seen in the past, that's been that kind of an effort has been virtually unsuccessful.
Where do we go from here, guys? I mean, round the horn. Where do we go? What's happening next? What's going to be
I'll
the
tell
next
you what. I'll tell you what. If you were a person who was unfortunate enough to be trying to cross the Golden Gate Bridge earlier this week, you will have witnessed what Joe Biden has wrought. And this is his party. These are left-wing people who were supposed to be supportive of him, but now what they're doing is they're going to overwhelm the Democratic National Convention. So Things can only get worse in the Middle East. We're not headed towards peace. We're headed towards further war. And they can only get worse for Joe Biden domestically on this issue because he's lost control, has no influence over either side, has infuriated everybody. And I don't know, guys, does anybody see any of this changing before November?
I
Well,
certainly
oil markets, the way they're responding to the fallout of the aerial assault is that the oil prices have been easing because investors seem to think that the geopolitical tensions have eased somewhat, and there's not going to be a major escalation by the Israeli government. The White House keeps insisting, or keeps, I think it was John Kirby during the press briefing on Monday when he was saying, "Oh, we're encouraging Israel to have restraint in its response." And I think John Clark mentioned this. Iran said, hey, if there's a counterattack, be prepared for, a fire and fury response. So, but if there's an escalation, of course, oil prices will just dramatically climb, and which would be beneficial to Iran because then, their oil sector, of course, would benefit.
Well, I mean, honestly, Andrew, it would be beneficial to anybody who's running against Joe Biden. If there is, a $5 price tag at a pump in Attica, Indiana, no.
Sarah, I just wanted to say that there's a simple, old, common sense truism that applies to Joe Biden and the political peril of this situation for him. And that is, when you try to be all things to all people, you wind up being nothing to nobody.
Nobody. Yep. Well, Israel will likely take the Biden administration's counsel to take the win about as seriously as Iran took the president's don't. We'll let you know when we know at Liberty Nation. Thanks, panel. President Biden appeared to take a strong stand against Iran as the hostile Mideast nation was threatening retaliation. But when the dust settled, he changed his mind on joining forces with Israel and advised them not to strike back. America's chief executive told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the Jewish nation, having just escaped a catastrophic onslaught of 170 attack drones, 30 cruise missiles, and 110 ballistic missiles, should take it as a win and not retaliate. So, hey, Israel, walk it off. Is that what we're hearing from the leader of the free world? It's an election year with a few months to go. What is the Biden strategy, Tim?
Well, best I can tell, Sarah, there is no strategy except to lurch back and forth based on the most recent demand of the extremists in his party. He said he would be unwavering. That's the word he used in his support of Israel. And then he immediately began to waver. And so has infuriated both sides in this because he can't take a position and stick with it. And I tell you what, that is what the hostile anti-American forces are mortal enemies in the world were counting on. They were counting on the almost certainty that Joe Biden would start to back down once he got political pressure, which he did from his left, from his extreme left, from the media, and from his own party. And so, best I can tell, he has no strategy other than to respond to the latest actions, such as, when these left-wing extremists, these radicals, started shutting down highways and airports and major arteries in big cities, it's really remarkable that they thought that would convince the people whose lives were disrupted, whose days were ruined, about the righteousness of their cause. Imagine being on the Golden Gate Bridge and you're stalled for 5 hours and you say, well, you know what? I guess they really have a point. I don't think so. So it's a quagmire, and it's why I've said that I think that Israel and the broader war in the Middle East could be the Waterloo for Joe Biden because he has lost control, or more accurately, ceded control with his weakness and vacillation. And neither side trusts him. And he has scorned Benjamin Netanyahu. And the mullahs in Iran are likely sitting around making jokes about the doctrine of don't. The doctrine of don't.
The
I love the
doctrine.
alliteration. I love the alliteration.
Oh, that was classic. That was classic. Do world leaders see the U.S. as a bunch of patsies, or weak, or strong, or we used to be the big dog in the yard? What happened?
Well, first, I will say that I live rent free in Sarah's head. I'll say that, but I think the best way to answer this question is by quoting Robert Herr: sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory. You know, geopolitical strife has been nothing new. It happened under Trump, but everything that's happened in the last couple of years under the current administration, Russia invading Ukraine, the attacks on Israel, a potential invasion of Taiwan, it's all been quite revealing because they see a guy who can barely string together two sentences. Why would they be afraid of a man who is unpopular at home, trying to seek re-election at a time when inflation is ravaging the country and price pressures are being revived? You know, it's probably that, you know, the global adversaries of America laughed at Trump, but they probably could not predict him because he was so erratic. He'd go on X and say, you know, hey, Rocket Man, I have bigger rockets than you do. I can fire them at any time. You know, Vladimir Putin, he was interviewed a couple of months ago, and he was saying how he would prefer Biden than Trump because Biden is more predictable. And of course, he's a standard politician. You know, he just follows, you know, the military industrial complex and the neocons and all the pro-war members of the Democratic Party. So it's understandable what would happen. But overall, it's guaranteed that the country's adversaries and probably even the U.S. allies see Joe Biden as a joke who can, you know, who can barely walk, and he wakes up late with the PAP mask on his, with the PAP marks on his face, you know.
CPAP mask. Yeah, he got
CPAP,
face wrinkles.
yes.
He got face wrinkles
Yeah.
from not his wrinkles. You know, John, I know that you went to a Kennedy event and met RFK Jr. And this year, Americans are faced with a big decision. And I'm wondering if Kennedy's going to be a third party, you know, come around to being more than just a guy who's going to poke holes in the two we got running.
The way they attack him by the Democrats certainly shows what they think of him. So I guess they won't be propping him up in place of Joe Biden because they're desperately looking, I hear, for another candidate before it's too late. I think it's already too late. I think a lot of people, interestingly, Democrats.
How the heck are you going to get rid of the guy? You can't just get rid of the guy. You can't just go step down. He is the president, and he's already declared, and he wants to finish the job. Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, how do you just get rid of the guy?
Well, so you can't, and you certainly can't run Kamala because she has achieved the amazing, stellar accomplishment of being even more unpopular and more inept. She probably could have handled Afghanistan better because that's also part of this legacy. Thomas Friedman pointed out in his book From Beirut to Jerusalem that the Arab culture is one where you do not want to show weakness. And Joe Biden is weak on everything. In fact, I think I just read this morning he's tripled steel tariffs against China to appease union workers here. And he's mad at China for subsidizing renewables while he subsidizes renewables. I mean, this administration, from the border to the economy to inflation, is just one series of lies and ineptitudes. It's rather horrifying. But I think a lot of Americans, in answer to your question, Democrats are afraid to switch their votes to RFK because they're worried they'll put Trump in. And Trump supporters are averse to switching their votes to RFK, even if they like him, because they're afraid they might put Biden in. But Tim, you're wrong. I mean, clearly gluing oneself to Rembrandts and closing down airports has got people wanting to get rid of oil. And so more protests. I mean, I'm being ironic there. No, it doesn't work. But who can appease these two sides in the Israel conflict? So I don't know where RFK lands in this, but I do believe that he is adding a voice that's much needed, particularly amongst the Democrat side, because the Democrats have the big schism now between their far left and the blue dog traditional Democrats. Sorry.
Well, you know, I don't get why they don't pick a side. They like Tim said earlier, there's an old adage that you can't be everything to everyone. So pick a side. Pick the side that's going to vote for you. I mean, the Jewish people have never really been in love with any Republican candidate, and I haven't figured that out yet, but there is a movement to walk away.
He won't do it because he's a coward. Joe Biden is not only weak, he's a coward. He cannot take the pressure that comes from him internationally. I mean, look, the moment that Trump left office, I won't say the moment, but within weeks or at most months after Donald Trump vacated the White House, Putin started lining his troops along the Ukrainian border.
Mm-hmm.
And so Joe Biden promptly says, well, if it's just a minor incursion, we won't do anything, which sends an unambiguous message that he's not going to do anything at all. And then in the Israeli conflict, it's pretty clear that the America's stated enemies, their mortal enemies, the people that want to wipe America off the map, those people were able to count on Joe Biden doing what they could never count on Donald Trump doing. So when Donald Trump was president, there was peace and prosperity. Those are still the fundamentals of an election. And when Joe Biden can claim to have produced neither peace nor prosperity, actually, he's produced the opposite in both cases.
Well, and you are 100% correct, but here's what bothers me a little bit. And Dave, I know you can answer this, but when the U.S. is at war, they don't like to change presidents. So will Trump rise or take a hit over the Middle East conflict?
Well, I think it's a lot more complicated than that, as we've seen over the course of history. And if you look at recent history, it doesn't appear to be the case. The notion got started, I think, under FDR in that era of World War II. But more recently, administrations have changed because of other factors. And you can just look in the midst of the Iranian crisis during Jimmy Carter's administration, the American people dumped him because he was inept at solving the crisis. And I think that you can look at the American people to see Joe Biden in the same way. The defining factor in whether, the American people keep a president in office, during a war or crisis is just basically determined by the voters' perception of how that president is handling the crisis. And we know for a fact that Joe Biden is totally inept at handling crisis. You don't have to look very far. He wasn't in office 9 months, and he stumbled, bumbled, and fumbled his way through the Afghan withdrawal. As John so rightly explained, it wasn't very long after he took office that Putin decides that he's going to put troops on the border with Ukraine. And it's because the perception of ineptitude and weakness is one in which it may be the only thing that the Biden administration excels in. And, it's going to be that as the dynamic that persuades the tide of voter opinion against the incumbent. And using that metric, Biden is in trouble.
I would add, though, if you look at the exit polls and the primaries on both sides of the aisle, for Republicans, foreign policy is not a top issue. It still remains economy and immigration. For the Democrats, foreign policy, again, is not a top issue. It's abortion and transgenderism.
Well, it's become a top issue now through no desire of theirs.
This current president is on the global hunt for support of a diplomatic solution. Wherever will that lead? We'll keep you in the loop. Thanks, panel. Someone posted on Quora a question the other day in light of the latest attack on Israel. I was nosing around looking for, a different perspective, I guess, except for the news. And here's the question. What's it like to grow up and live in Israel? The answer might surprise most Americans. The culture is the same, the commenter posted. Education is better. The potential to succeed is higher. We suffer some missiles here and there, but you get used to it. And they continue to thrive. The day after 300 drones and missiles were launched at Israel, people were out shopping, going to work, school. Just another day in the Holy Land. Americans call in sick if there's a late night of partying. John Clark, are the Israeli people showing us how to be a resilient culture?
Well, I think they always have. Tablet magazine, after the attack, started with the headline, "They tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat." And that's actually been the mantra of Jews for a long time, if you study their culture. And as captured in your quote, it's really more like an Americanized culture. It's really not like the rest of the Middle East. Abortions are legal. Homosexuality is not persecuted with death or stoning. Transgender surgeries are performed there. In Iran, you can get the death penalty for more than 5 kilograms of hashish. So it's probably best to keep it down for personal consumption. But it's really, the Israeli culture is probably in a largely secular culture is a lot more like America, but that resilience is missing here. And you're right, I think. And as things heat up there, and if our oil supplies are compromised, we're going to see that we're a bunch of headless chickens in contrast. They just threaten our pocketbooks, and we don't eat and we don't celebrate. But the Jews are a really resilient people, and that's very much part of their culture.
Is that the culture of the Middle East per se, Andrew? Or is it just Israel's a badass, tough country?
I think you summarized this discussion in your introduction, because yes, I mean, if you're under constant threat of bombardment and missiles and annihilation, you just become accustomed to it, become immune to it. And I believe that Iron Dome defense that was on display during the aerial assault by Iran should confirm that Israel is an impressive fortress and challenging to penetrate. I've never been in Israel, probably never will be in Israel, but I can understand why people just go about their days. You saw the same thing in Ukraine. Despite the mainstream media claiming that it was on the brink of annihilation, you saw footage of people just going about their days. Young people are going to nightclubs. McDonald's was still being patronized. It was in great shape. People move on. If you're used to this, you just move on. I'm sure in places like Canada, if we were under constant threat of being nuked by the United States, I think we'd be go to Tim Hortons and drink our double doubles and cry. But overall, I mean, over time you get accustomed to it.
I'll have to say, I was in a restaurant in Mexico a long time ago with a girlfriend. We were having lunch, and about 10 yards away, the entire roof caved in on diners, and they just moved. They got new food. They didn't block the thing. They didn't tell us to leave. They fed us and we moved on. So I'm kind of wondering where America lost this. And I'm wondering, politically speaking, is it our government? Do they have any understanding of us or the Israelis? Tim?
Well, I don't think any Americans have any clue of what it's like to live on a 25-mile swath of land surrounded by about 24 countries committed to your destruction. Think about that. It'd be like living in Vermont, John, and having New Hampshire and Connecticut and New York and Canada all trying to destroy your civilization and your ability to even exist. This is what it's like in Israel. And I think we need to remember what an unbelievable achievement the nation of Israel even was. This is essentially a useless swath of sand in the middle of the desert that they have turned into an oasis of democracy. If you've been there, as I have, you'll see an industrious people, a thriving democracy. You see wealth. You don't see much poverty, but you do see a welfare state. Everybody's taken care of, and you also see defense, a defense that is unlike anything in the world. Try to get away with anything at the Tel Aviv airport, and you will learn about the intensity of Israeli security. I mean, one of the notable features of it, too, was that the women, you want to talk about badass, the women at the airport who were basically dressing down everybody in line to make sure that they were not in any way affiliated with Israel's enemies. They were frightening. So, this culture, ever since the Holocaust and probably before it, has been used to being the victims of an angry and anti-Semitic world. And they become so accustomed to it that they, as was just said, they know how to live amidst it. And I think it is galling beyond all measure to the entire Arab world, which has unlimited supplies of oil and land, that none of them have achieved the success that Israel has, with a tiny swath of land with no oil or natural resources, really, except probably olives. And it's pure envy that goes along with the hatred of Israel's enemies.
I want to posit a question. Is mandatory military service something this country should consider?
Oh, my goodness. There are some decisions countries make that are pretty hard to reverse. And in 1973, when the United States went to the all-volunteer military, it was in part to solve the domestic acrimony over the draft in order to supply manpower. But there was an argument that said maintaining an all-volunteer force provided higher quality because you got people who really wanted to be in the service. And to a certain extent, I think that was true. But quite frankly, overcoming the inertia of what has become an established all-volunteer system will be very difficult. But nonetheless, one would say it's doable, but it would take great effort. Well, in some respects, Sarah, it's already been considered. We still have a selective service system, and all of the institutional processes are in place to gin up the conscription again.
I would like to see, I think the question actually is more about what percentage of today's young Americans would be willing to go to war for their country. That's not a question.
What if war came here?
That didn't have to be asked during World War I or World War II. It started to be asked in Korea, and then the quagmire, the disaster that was Vietnam. Now, given the progressive bent of the culture and how these cultural Marxists have penetrated every element of American society, together with the indoctrination of universities, I put a question to all of you. Do you really think we have a young generation that would be willing to fight to defend their country?
But here's the thing, though. You're not fighting to defend your country. You're fighting to defend other countries. That's America's foreign policy now, fighting to defend Israel.
Well, this is a theoretical.
You're not fighting for America.
Okay, but this is a theoretical question because Sarah started with the issue of conscription. So I'm saying, okay, conscription, if it is to happen, is it something that we can even get over on people without them basically creating protests that would shut down the ability to even conscript people?
But would this war be justified? Would it be based on false pretenses? Because nearly every single war that the United States has been involved in, or Americans were forced to go and die for, has been based on false pretenses. The Gulf of Tonkin incident comes to mind. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Or is it actually legitimate?
What about World War II? What about that?
What about the hypothetical?
I'll ask Pat Buchanan that question.
Here? What if war comes here? That's my hypothetical.
What you think, Andrew, if you are going to say that we went into World War II on false pretenses, then I would ask you, what do you think would have happened if we didn't go in and Hitler had overrun the few places that he had not yet overrun, and we said, we're going to wash our hands of it. We don't want to get involved in foreign disputes. Was that Was our involvement on that based on false pretenses?
No, I did not say that. However, I would say that FDR was very desperate to muster up public U.S. support to join the Second World War, that he probably employed every means necessary to ensure that happened. And you have to understand, too, when it came to Japan attacking
Resisted
Pearl
for
Harbor,
a long time, Andrew. He resisted the aggressive posture of Winston Churchill, who was publicly demanding that the U.S. enter the war, and he resisted for the longest time until D-Day.
As they always say, the proof is in the pudding, or the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And when the Congress voted to go to war, there was only one person that voted against it, and not a very well-liked person after that. That the fact that the United States was attacked, I think that always has something to do with the enthusiasm for taking on an adversary. And in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think that the killing of over 3,000 people within the United States brought the fact that the United States is not insular, but must take care of its enemies where you find them. And in this case, it was in the Middle East, and particularly in Afghanistan. And there was a great enthusiasm to go do that.
But the United States, well, what the United States did, though, in Afghanistan is that they did not go after their enemies. So what they did was nation building, which is something that George W. Bush was adamantly against when he ran in 2000. He didn't want to be the world's policeman. He didn't want a nation build. And lo and behold, that's what the United States was forced to go into for 20 years, building a nation. And then what happened after withdrawal? Now the Taliban's in power, people are suffering, economies collapsing. These foreign adventures do not bode well for the United States itself. You can understand why that whole America First foreign policy was large.
Whoop, everybody.
Andrew, I'll just say one more thing, which is that, you're correct in most ways about Iraq. Just to add a little nuance to this, Andrew, I would say part of what you're saying is right. In other words, the worthiness of the cause, but a greater part of it is not the war itself, but the conduct of the war, and the fact that we fought to a draw in Korea, we lost in Vietnam, we essentially lost in Iraq. Now, if we had won all of those conflicts, I think people might have felt different about war and the U.S. military in general in this 21st century.
I think there was a great conversation.
Andrew, I am wrapping this up. I told you I was going to wrap it up, and we are so far off topic. So I'm going to wrap it up with topic, and then you're going to sit still and be a good boy. You have to give Israelis credit for not cowering under the covers and instead living fearlessly every day. We could learn a lot from our allies. Sorry, Andrew, but I got the last word. War is expensive and sometimes fruitful for the nations involved. Although emotion is usually the driving force for Americans, taxpayers should take note of how much it will cost if we get ourselves mixed up in another Mideast war. The national debt is well above $34 trillion. The budget deficit is poised to be around $1.8 trillion this fiscal year. Interest payments are inching towards $1 trillion. I don't even know how to calculate that. And America's unfunded liabilities and expenditures are approximately $200 trillion. Hope you guys got calculators out there. I in no way understand any of that. I'm a word girl. That's why Andrew Moran is in the house to talk about the finances of war.
Well, actually, technically, it's $1.5 trillion, according to recent CBO estimates. But anyway, I'm not sure if there was a question there, but if your question was, can the U.S. afford another war? The answer is a resounding no. First, on the fiscal front, the U.S. will permanently run a $1 trillion plus budget deficit for the next 10, 20 years, according to CBO numbers. Interest payments are exceeding, sorry, Dave, defense spending. The U.S. government will not be able to afford to keep up with Social Security and Medicare costs in the next decade. And for some reason, the lovely men and women in Washington think the U.S. can sustain multiple wars at the same time. Now, if you look at the broader economic issue, the tension in the Middle East, from Israel and Iran to the chaos in the Red Sea, have already lifted oil and gas prices and have contributed to the price pressures in the latest CPI reports. Now, imagine if the conflict between Israel and Iran accelerates and expands into the wider region. Of course, oil could easily touch $100 a barrel once again. So the U.S. meddling in global affairs is bad economics, but the U.S. has to maintain this dominance because it's been doing this for so long. And why is it doing it for so long? To sustain the dollar hegemony in the global marketplace.
John Clark, what will U.S. involvement in a war do to food supplies here in the U.S.?
Well, I think that may be the elephant that you can't eat in the living room. There is behind this escalation of tensions, I think Americans feel that it's something they can watch while they eat their popcorn, that it's happening far away from them, sort of like Chinese pollution from manufacturing our renewable energy products. But it has dramatic potential impacts here that would be seismic, and that is our oil supplies are still coming from there. The world's oil prices are still determined from there. Iran, along with China and Russia, have been maneuvering for some time to secure oil prices for their countries, but also food supplies. And that alliance has hurt us internationally. We are a nation that is very much more dependent on food from abroad, and therefore food transportation and the associated costs of trucking that food across our country and shipping it here. So food inflation is already being exacerbated by Biden policies of increased regulations on farmers and other aspects of regulations that are driving up inflation. And if we see an outbreak of war in the Middle East, whether or not it's nuclear, that impacts oil transport through the Strait of Hormuz and other choke points for our oil supplies, we may see something much worse than OPEC, because now we wouldn't be just starved at the gas stations. We would be starved at the grocery stores.
Well, I can tell you this, there is not one American today that's probably ready for rations. That's not going to go over well. They haven't struggled for years. You know, I mean, that's a 1940s thing. Dave, whether we can afford it or not, are we ready to put boots on the ground somewhere?
Well, I believe the American people, I think they get the fact that we've got a spineless and indecisive president and who has no sense of how to navigate the waters of a crisis. And putting American fighting men and women in harm's way in a foreign country with the current inept crowd in the White House and a toady leadership in the Pentagon would be highly dangerous. We already have a significant number of individuals that we send out to fight our country's wars already in areas throughout the world, particularly in the Middle East. And people are seeing that those folks are not being used well. They sit in bases. They fly out to take out Houthi missiles and anti-ship missiles that are targeting merchant vessels in the Red Sea, and they're on defense all the time. And when you're on defense, you're not going to destroy the threat that faces you. You have to go and do it, and this administration will not do that. And so consequently, unless there is an attack on the continental United States, I think that the American citizen taxpayer will not go for putting large numbers of U.S. forces in foreign lands. It just won't happen.
And you bring up a point. Those are voters, maybe some of them. I don't know where we're at on that on the voter rolls, but Tim, how does a threat, just the threat of a world war, impact the vote? We're only 6.5 months out, and things are all over the place.
I think there's a growing and pervasive sense that this country is being surrounded more and more by its enemies who are intent on destroying our culture from within and destroying our influence without. And this is something that the voters are very aware of. One of the things that's hard to do is to put yourself, because everybody has their own personal point of view on things. It's hard to put yourself in the position of voters trying to determine here, or really to determine how other people are feeling about this, because I've talked to so many people who say, my God, this is just falling apart. We've got two hot wars going on, plus the threat in Taiwan, plus Afghanistan's become a training ground for terrorists again. And it's a cesspool just like it was before we went in and spent 20 years there, only to leave with a situation that was even worse than when we went in. But when Afghanistan happened, his numbers collapsed, and they have not recovered since. And the second time that they collapsed was right after October 7th. So you can see that the American people do care and do pay attention to the matter of foreign wars. The only thing that Biden may have going for him in terms of attention to foreign policy and foreign wars is that the domestic situation is so bad that people are paying attention to their own pocketbooks, and they're trying to account for the fact that a bag of groceries that cost $100 in 2021 now costs $137. That's what people are dealing with every day. But there's some quick fixes that Biden can try with his domestic issues, like releasing from the Strategic Petroleum Preserve, trying to hector the Federal Reserve into dropping interest rates, these kind of things. But there's nothing he can do about these foreign wars. He's proven that. And when Donald Trump left office, 0 foreign wars. Now we essentially have 2, and another one brewing in Taiwan and possibly again in Afghanistan. I don't think the comparison of those 2 records could be any more stark.
Well, we get Russia and China sitting around ready to team up, or maybe they have.
And that's really the most dangerous development that we found. I mean, it's like Russia and China. It's like Xi Jinping and Putin getting together and saying, this guy, Biden, I mean, we can roll him so easily. Let's work together. Because he's not going to come up with an effective response. And I can't even imagine 4 more years of this kind of international weakness and what we would look like after another 4 years of Joe Biden as commander-in-chief.
I think what's funny, though, geopolitically is that, if the relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping, who has the upper hand? Because Russia needs China a lot more than China needs Russia at this point. You look at the BRICS, the BRICS coalition and the BRICS Plus, that thing is in shambles just because these people have no clue who wants to be leader, whose interests are the best interests of the BRICS. So I think once, maybe a war in Ukraine is successful or Taiwan is trampled, what happens afterward? What happens in this newfound partnership between all of America's adversaries? Who will be on top? Who's the next superpower? China wants to be it, but then what if Russia wants to be it? Or what if, India wants to be it? So all these different factors that nobody trusts each other, and it's going to end in mayhem probably.
The superpower in the global superpower needs to be the United States, period. We're the only people that can keep peace with all these yahoos. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, panel. Well, that's it for our Conservative 5 panel today. Check out our other C5 shows and segments on your favorite video platform, YouTube, Vimeo, Rumble. We're on them all. As well, Liberty Nation has its own Roku channel, where you can see all of our TV productions. I'm your host, Sarah Cowgill. Thanks for joining us today. for free thinking, free speech, libertynation.com.